At exactly 6:32 a.m., I stood in my kitchen sipping coffee and staring out at my backyard when my pool turned an electric cobalt blue. Not the calm, sparkling blue of a hotel resort, but the deep, glowing shade you'd expect from an alien spacecraft. I nearly dropped my mug. 10 minutes earlier, it had looked perfectly normal. Now it was radiating color so intense it made the lawn look like it had been bleached. That's when I noticed movement, shadows by the side gate, the unmistakable sound of whispered giggles, and the click of the latch. The first head that popped into view was crowned with a mess of curls and a rhinestone tiara, followed by another head draped in a white veil. And just like that, my quiet Saturday morning became the opening scene of a wedding party invasion. I slid the door open and stepped outside, the smell of chlorine stronger than usual, now mixed with perfume and hairspray. The bride, mid-20s, beaming and oblivious, kicked off her heels and strutted toward my pool like it had been booked for her big day. Behind her trailed about 15 guests, dresses in pastel shades, pressed suits, and high heels sinking into my lawn. And at the back, waddling in a blush-pink mother-of-the-bride gown, was Karen from the HOA. Of course it was Karen. Her eyes landed on me like I was the one crashing their party. She raised her chin. "We're just using it for photos," she announced, as if that explained why several groomsmen were already unbuttoning their shirts and lining up at the deep end. My coffee was still in hand, steam curling in the morning air, and for a few long seconds I didn't move or speak. I wanted her to keep talking, to explain how she thought walking 15 people into my backyard at dawn was something she could wave away with a sentence. And she did. Karen always delivered. "The clubhouse pool is too small," she said, "and besides, your landscaping makes a better backdrop. We'll be done before you know it." It was almost funny. Almost. Because in her mind, property lines weren't actual boundaries, they were gentle suggestions. But the color of the pool wasn't my imagination. It was brighter by the second, like someone had poured paint into it. A bridesmaid paused at the edge, her face scrunching. "Is it supposed to be this color?" she asked, dipping a finger in. Karen swatted her hand away. "It's fine, just get in." The first splash echoed across the yard. Then another. Soon half the wedding party was in, shrieking and laughing, their pastel dresses turning heavy and dark in the water. I leaned against the patio post, taking in the scene. This wasn't a fight to start now, it was one to win later. Every move Karen made was a game of status and control, and I'd learned a long time ago that arguing in the moment just gave her the drama she wanted. But as the water churned around them, something else happened. The bridesmaid who dipped her hand earlier pulled it out and stared at it. The fingertips were stained blue. Not pale, not a faint tint blue. The next scream wasn't playful. "My dress!" someone shrieked. The groomsmen looked down at their shirts, blotches of color spreading like ink. In the middle of the chaos, the bride twisted in the water, her veil trailing out like a jellyfish, her skin now tinted the exact same cobalt as my pool. Karen was out of her shoes now, yelling at them to calm down, insisting it would wash out. But the longer they stayed in, the darker it got, until every single person in the water looked like they'd been dipped in dye. A surreal stillness hit me then. Because the thing was, I hadn't touched that pool since last night, and yet I knew exactly why it looked like that. It wasn't sabotage. Not yet. It was something far more interesting. A chemical fluke I'd been meaning to fix for weeks, triggered by the cheap brand of sunscreen the clubhouse kept stocked in their bathrooms. A coincidence, yes, but the kind of coincidence you file away for later. The shrieking turned to frantic splashing as guests scrambled out, dripping blue onto the patio, onto my grass, onto themselves. Someone started crying. The bride was swearing. Karen, damp and furious, rounded on me like I'd personally rigged it. "What did you put in the water?" she demanded, her face blotchy with heat. I sipped my coffee and tilted my head. "Chlorine," I said. "You know, like in every other pool on the planet." She jabbed a finger toward the water. "This is vandalism. You'll be hearing from the board." Behind her, A groomsman was holding his ruined dress shirt at arm's length, as if it might infect him further. I watched them file out my gate, blue footprints marking their trail, and knew two things. 1. Karen would turn this into an HOA issue within the hour. And 2. This was the smallest, quietest victory I'd ever scored against her, and I wasn't about to waste it. If she thought this morning was the worst thing that could happen, she had no idea what I could do when I stopped relying on accident. This time I hadn't planned it. Next time I would. By the time I'd finished my second cup of coffee, I could see Karen's pearl-pink sedan crawling down the street toward my driveway. It was the kind of slow, menacing approach that told me she was either about to present a lawsuit or demand to use my Wi-Fi. Sure enough, she parked at a 45-degree angle, half in my drive, half on the street, slammed the door, and stomped toward my porch with a folder clutched under one arm. Her hair was still shellacked into the same lacquered helmet from that morning's pool invasion, but her lipstick was a fresh, angry red. I opened the door before she could knock. "We need to talk about the damage you've caused," she said, waving the folder like a priest brandishing a Bible at a demon. I let her in, mostly because it was humid outside and I didn't want her dripping on my welcome mat. She sat herself down at my kitchen table without being asked and started unloading what looked like a stack of complaints, typed letters, printed photos, even a spreadsheet. Each page was more dramatic than the last. Shots of bridesmaids crying in blue-streaked gowns, close-ups of stained cuffs, even one picture of the bride glaring into the camera like she was about to swear eternal vengeance. Karen slid the spreadsheet toward me. "This is the total for clothing replacements, salon appointments, and the hotel's deep cleaning fee for their honeymoon suite." My eyes scanned down the numbers, each row more absurd than the last. $600 for a veil. $900 for emergency spa treatments. I almost asked what exactly a spa was supposed to do about a blue bride, but I decided to save that pleasure for later. I leaned back in my chair. "Interesting," I said, setting the papers down. "And how do you figure this is my responsibility?" She stared at me like I'd just asked why water was wet. "Because it's your pool," she said. "Your contaminated water. You invited them in, no, wait. You allowed them in by failing to secure your property." It was peak Karen logic. Break into someone's yard, ruin your own clothes, then demand the homeowner foot the bill. I pointed out, calmly, that I hadn't invited anyone, and in fact had been quite surprised to find my backyard full of unannounced wedding guests. "That's trespassing," I said, "and in our state, trespassers are liable for any harm they cause themselves." Karen's lips twitched, but she pressed on. "The HOA bylaws state that all members must maintain safe and usable facilities on their property. That pool was not safe or usable." I could have laughed. My backyard wasn't a facility, under any definition of the word, and she knew it. But this was Karen's favorite tactic: declare something an HOA matter and hope the target backed down before calling her bluff. Unfortunately for her, bluff calling was my sport of choice. I reminded her, with my best neighborly smile, that I had security cameras covering the pool area. High-resolution ones. Ones that had recorded every moment of her little unauthorized photo shoot that morning. Her fingers froze mid-fiddle with her necklace. "I can send the footage to the board," I said lightly. "Of course, if you'd rather handle this quietly, I can also send it straight to the police." The look on her face was worth more than the entire spreadsheet total. But Karen wasn't done. She switched tactics. If I refused to pay, she'd bring it to a vote at the next HOA meeting. She'd get the board to fine me for noncompliance, for negligence, for she trailed off, realizing she'd run out of plausible violations. I told her that sounded like an excellent idea. In fact, I'd be happy to attend the meeting and share my own evidence with all the homeowners. And since the bylaws clearly prohibited unauthorized use of another member's property, perhaps the fine should go the other way. Her jaw tightened. "You're making this worse for yourself," she said. I shrugged. "Funny, I was thinking the same about you." She gathered her papers in a huff and stood. "This isn't over," she threw over her shoulder. I know, I said, because I'm not done yet. An hour later, I was on my laptop drafting an email to the entire neighborhood mailing list. Short, sweet, and just factual enough to sting. I explained that there had been an incident involving unauthorized use of my pool, resulting in property damage to the intruders themselves. I mentioned that I had full video footage, that the police had been informed, and that I was reviewing my options for trespassing charges. No names, no direct accusations, just enough to make everyone curious. By sunset, I had 17 replies from neighbors asking for details, 3 offering to testify that they'd seen the wedding party entering my yard, and 1 suggesting I dye the pool green next time for variety. The real treat came the next morning when I found a flyer taped to my mailbox, a formal notice for a special HOA meeting scheduled 3 days from now. The topic: pool contamination and neighborhood standards. It had Karen's fingerprints all over it. This was her attempt to rally the board against me, to make my morning's private win into a public humiliation. But she didn't realize she'd just given me the perfect stage. I spent those 3 days preparing. I printed stills from my security footage, clear, full-color shots of each trespasser climbing through my gate. I ordered an enlarged print of the bride mid-splash, veil floating like seaweed, skin already turning blue. I even had a little fun with the science, printing out an article on the harmless chemical interaction that caused the staining. By the time the meeting rolled around, my folder was as thick as Karen's had been in my kitchen, but mine was loaded with ammunition. The meeting was held in the community center, the air-conditioned blandness of beige walls and folding chairs. I arrived early, set up my stack of papers, and waited. Karen swept in like a general leading troops, flanked by the mother of the bride and 2 board members who always voted her way. The rest of the seats filled quickly. Apparently, word had spread that something juicy was about to go down. Karen opened the meeting with a dramatic recounting of the horrifying experience her family had suffered. She talked about toxic dyes, about reckless negligence, about the emotional trauma of having her daughter's special day ruined by my negligence. Every word was polished for maximum outrage. People nodded, murmured, glanced in my direction. And then it was my turn. I started by playing the security footage on the community center's projector. The room was silent except for the sound of the latch clicking, the giggles, the splashes. By the time the bride screamed about her dress, several people were covering their mouths to hide smiles. Then I distributed the stills, passing them down each row, letting everyone take in the clarity, the undeniable evidence of who had been where and when. Finally, I pulled out the article. I explained, in my calmest voice, that the blue dye was the result of an entirely harmless reaction between sunscreen and pool chemicals. Not sabotage. Not negligence. Just science. And then I reminded the room of the trespassing laws in our state. Of the HOA bylaw about respecting property boundaries. Of the liability rules that made the trespasser responsible for their own mis. I knew Karen well enough to predict her next move before she made it. Public defeat at an HOA meeting wasn't the kind of thing she could let go, especially not when it came with witnesses and laughter at her expense. She would come back harder, louder, and with twice as many half-baked accusations. That's why I spent the next week not just on defense, but on offense. If she wanted a war over my pool, I was going to give her a full-blown arms race. The first sign of retaliation came on a Tuesday morning, when I found an official-looking envelope stuffed into my mailbox. It was a courtesy notice from the HOA, citing me for unapproved exterior alterations. The alteration in question? The color of my pool water. Apparently, any change to the aesthetic character of a property's visible amenities required prior written approval from the board. I actually laughed out loud reading it. The HOA had never once mentioned pool watercolor in any rule book, but Karen had clearly spent the weekend combing the bylaws for something, anything, she could twist into a weapon. I called the HOA office, which was really just Linda in a small, stale-smelling room behind the community center. Linda had been there for years and had a front-row seat to every one of Karen's crusades. She answered on the first ring, and I could hear the weariness in her voice. "I know," she said before I could even speak. "You got the letter. Just don't pay it yet. Between us, there's nothing in the bylaws about pool watercolor, and I'm not processing that fine until the board votes on it. Which might take months," she added dryly. Her tone told me she'd had enough of Karen, but she couldn't outright take sides. That was fine, I wasn't counting on her to. This was my game to play. I thanked her, hung up, and went to work setting my next move in motion. The thing about living in this neighborhood was that everyone pretended they hated drama, but secretly thrived on it. And nothing drew a crowd like a feud between two high-profile homeowners. I decided to give them something to talk about. If Karen wanted to act like my pool color was a crime against the community's image, I was going to make sure that crime became the most talked-about thing in town. First, I bought a set of programmable LED pool lights, the kind that could cycle through dozens of colors at the push of a button. I installed them the same day they arrived and set them to rotate slowly between vivid purple, neon green, and deep crimson every night from 7 to 11 p.m. By the second evening, people were walking their dogs past my house just to watch the display. The HOA couldn't touch me, lights weren't alterations, and the water itself stayed its natural blue during the day. Sure enough, I spotted Karen the following evening, parked across the street in her pearl pink sedan, phone in hand, taking photos of the offending spectacle. She didn't notice me watching from the shadows of my porch, but I could practically feel her seething from 20 feet away. She was building a case, but she didn't realize that every photo she took of my pool also documented her habit of parking in a fire lane to stalk my property. But the lights were just the appetizer. The main course was an event I started planning that week, a neighborhood blue party. I designed flyers in bright cobalt, printed them at the local copy shop, and hand-delivered them to every mailbox except hers. The invitation was simple: come enjoy the most talked-about pool in the neighborhood. Wear white. Snacks and drinks provided. Saturday at 3 p.m. sharp. I didn't need to say the words to annoy Karen. Everyone knew exactly what the subtext was. By Friday, I'd heard from at least 20 households that they were coming. Several neighbors told me they couldn't wait to see the famous water for themselves. Karen, of course, got wind of it almost immediately. At noon that day, I found a second notice taped to my door. This one claiming I needed an HOA permit to host a neighborhood gathering of more than 12 people. I smiled as I peeled it off. That rule only applied to gatherings in common areas, not private property. Karen either didn't know that or was counting on me not knowing it. Saturday arrived bright and hot, perfect pool weather. By 2:45, my backyard was filling with people in white t-shirts, dresses, and shorts, chatting and laughing under strings of blue balloons. I'd stocked the cooler with drinks, laid out trays of snacks, and made sure my LED lights were set to stay on bright cobalt for the entire afternoon. The pool shimmered under the sunlight, every ripple reflecting a color so vivid it almost glowed. At exactly 3:10, the side gate rattled. Karen didn't bother with the front door. She marched straight in from the street, dressed in her usual pastel blazer, and clutching a manila envelope. The conversations died down, replaced by a low hum of anticipation. She scanned the crowd like a principal catching students cutting class, then zeroed in on me. "This is an unauthorized gathering," she announced, holding up the envelope as if it were a warrant. "You're in violation of HOA Code 5.3.2 regarding neighborhood disturbances." The people nearest to her exchanged amused glances. I asked her calmly what exactly constituted a disturbance. She pointed at the pool. That color. And this crowd. You're deliberately antagonizing the community." I stepped forward, gesturing toward the water. "Actually, Karen, this is just normal pool water with decorative lighting. You're welcome to test it. In fact, why don't you stay and enjoy the party?" Someone in the back snorted. Karen's face went pink, well, pinker than usual. She started to launch into another rule citation, but I raised my voice just enough for everyone to hear. Funny thing about antagonizing the community, it kind of loses its punch when the community is here enjoying themselves. I swept a hand toward the laughing, sunbathing crowd. Karen looked around and saw, for the first time, that more than half the HOA's voting members were in my yard, sipping lemonade and chatting like we were all old friends. The power shift was palpable. Karen's posture stiffened, and for a second I thought she might actually try to shut the whole thing down on the spot. But she must have realized how bad that would look, trying to evict a crowd of friendly neighbors from a backyard barbecue. Instead, she shoved the envelope at me, muttered, "You'll regret this," and stormed back through the gate. I waited until she was gone before opening it. Inside was a formal notice of a mandatory compliance inspection, scheduled for Monday morning. The excuse? Verification of water safety and filtration systems. Translation: Karen was trying to find some official reason to declare my pool unsafe. That night, I sat on my porch as the last guests left, sipping the last cold soda from the cooler. The party had been a hit. People were still talking about the color of the water as they left. And every single one of them had seen Karen crash the event and get brushed off in front of the whole crowd. I knew she'd come at me harder now, probably with inspectors in tow. That was fine. I was ready. Because here's the thing, Karen had one major weakness. She only fought battles she thought she could win quickly. The second they got messy, she lost momentum. So my plan was simple: make this one as messy as possible. If she wanted an inspection, she was going to get an inspection she'd never forget. Monday morning dawned hot and cloudless, the kind of day that made you grateful for air conditioning and suspicious of anyone in a blazer. I had already been outside for an hour, pacing the edge of the pool with my coffee, checking every angle to make sure it looked pristine. The water was glass clear, the skimmer basket quietly doing its job, the faint hum of the filtration system purring like a cat. Nothing about it would give away what I'd tucked in there the night before, sealed capsules that would dissolve into a slow-blooming wave of color later in the day. At exactly 9:03 a.m., a white SUV with HOA compliance stenciled on the side rolled up to my driveway. It wasn't one of the official city code enforcement vehicles, just a leased car with vinyl letters, the kind the HOA used to make themselves look more important than they were. Out stepped a man in a polo shirt tucked into khakis, carrying a clipboard and a sample kit. And right behind him, like a moth to a porch light, came Karen. She was in a pale lavender blazer today, a matching skirt, and heels that were already sinking into the soft lawn. "Morning," the inspector said politely, ignoring the way Karen hovered close enough to breathe down his neck. He introduced himself as Greg, gave me a rehearsed explanation about routine verification of water safety, and asked if he could take a look at the pool. I gestured toward the gate. Of course. I wouldn't want the HOA to think I was hiding anything. Karen's lips tightened like I'd just accused her of paranoia. Greg started by taking water samples from both ends of the pool. I watched him fill the little vials, label them, and set them carefully in a cooler. He dipped a testing strip, squinted at it, and made a few notes. Chlorine levels perfect, pH balanced, no visible contaminant. He even commented on how clean the tiles were. I thanked him, pretending not to notice the way Karen's face fell slightly with each glowing remark. She tried to steer the conversation. "Ask him about the color," she hissed, loud enough for me to hear. Greg glanced at her. "The water looks fine," he said. Karen pressed on. "It wasn't fine last week. It was unnaturally blue. Practically glowing." I shrugged. "Must have been the sunlight. Or maybe your sunglasses." By 9:30, Greg was packing up his kit. "Everything here is compliant," he said, shaking my hand. "I'll file the report this afternoon." Karen's jaw tightened so hard I thought I heard her molars grind. Greg climbed back into his SUV and pulled away. And right on cue, as the sound of his tires faded, the first faint ribbons of cobalt began to swirl at the deep end of the pool. Karen noticed instantly. Her eyes went wide, and she jabbed a finger toward the water. There. See. It's happening again. I stepped closer, tilted my head, and squinted like I wasn't sure what she meant. Must be a trick of the light, I said. She sputtered, her hands flapping toward the now unmistakably blue water. You did this on purpose. She was so close to stomping her foot I almost laughed. Before she could launch into a full rant, my phone buzzed. It was a neighbor from 3 houses down, one of the ones who'd been at the blue party. Word's out, she said. People are walking over to see the pool. I turned toward the street, and sure enough, within 10 minutes a slow trickle of curious neighbors started drifting up the sidewalk. A retired couple from around the corner. A guy walking his golden retriever. Even 2 teenagers with iced coffees. Karen realized she was losing control of the scene. She tried to block the gate, insisting the water was dangerously altered, but the more she talked, the more people leaned around her to get a better look. The compliments started right away. It's beautiful, one woman said. You should do this for the 4th of July. A man joked. Someone asked if the color was safe to swim in, and I assured them it was. Greg the inspector had just given me a clean bill of health not 15 minutes ago. Karen's eyes darted from face to face, looking for someone to take her side, but no one bit. I could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. She couldn't make this a safety issue anymore without contradicting the inspector's report. So she shifted to a new angle: property values. If buyers see neon pools, they'll think this neighborhood is trashy, she declared. That earned a few raised eyebrows, but not much else. The crowd eventually thinned out, but not before half a dozen people had taken photos of the pool and promised to post them in the neighborhood Facebook group. By noon, my phone was lighting up with likes and comments, people joking about making it a new community tradition, or asking if I took blue pool appointments for special events. Karen hadn't just lost this round, she'd accidentally turned my pool into a local attraction. But I wasn't done. Because if there was one thing I knew about Karen, it was that she hated being the punchline even more than she hated losing control. And now she was both. So I decided to twist the knife. That afternoon, I updated the listing on my short-term rental account, not for my house, but for private pool photography sessions. The photos showed the pool in all its electric blue glory, surrounded by tasteful seating and a few artfully placed towels. Hourly rate. Just high enough to irritate Karen, but low enough that people would actually book. It took less than 24 hours for the first request to come in. A local influencer who wanted a mermaid shoot with her friends. I scheduled them for Saturday, and made sure the booking confirmation was visible to anyone peeking into my backyard. Which, of course, Karen did. She cornered me the next morning, demanding to know if I was running a business out of my home without HOA approval. I told her I was merely sharing my amenities with fellow residents and guests, which, according to the bylaws, I was perfectly entitled to do. Her face flushed pink, then red, then almost purple. She stormed off without another word. That's when I realized she was shifting gears again, going from trying to punish me herself to trying to recruit allies. Over the next 2 days, I heard from at least 3 neighbors that she'd been knocking on doors, warning people about my reckless behavior, and how it would set a bad precedent. But instead of gaining sympathy, she was just reminding people of the wedding pool fiasco. One neighbor told me she couldn't get through her little speech without someone asking, "Didn't you trespass into his yard in the first place?" By Friday, I could tell Karen was reaching a breaking point. She was quieter than usual, but it was the kind of quiet you get right before a thunderstorm. I figured she was planning something dramatic for the weekend, probably to coincide with the influencer pool shoot. So I made my own preparations. The mermaid party arrived Saturday afternoon. 3 women in glittering swimsuits, a photographer, and a couple of helpers carrying props. They were polite, paid in cash, and dove right into their poses. The pool water was in its deepest, richest shade of blue, and with the sun hitting it just right, the whole scene looked like something out of a travel magazine. Passers-by stopped to watch from the sidewalk. It happened on a Tuesday night, the kind of summer evening when the air was heavy but the neighborhood was quiet, save for the occasional hum of sprinklers. I was halfway through a late dinner when I heard the metallic creak of my side gate. At first, I thought it might be a stray cat or one of the neighbor's kids cutting through, but then came the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the concrete around my pool. Slow. Intentional. I killed the kitchen light and moved to the back door, careful not to be seen. The motion light flicked on, and there she was, Karen, wearing black yoga pants and a hoodie pulled tight around her head, as if the disguise could make her invisible. She was holding something in her right hand, and when she knelt by the pool, I saw the outline of a plastic container. It took me a second to register what she was doing. She popped the lid and started sprinkling a fine powder into the water, glancing over her shoulder every few seconds. Whatever it was, it didn't dissolve right away. It floated in little clusters before breaking apart. My first thought was that she'd finally gone off the deep end and was trying to ruin the water. My second thought was that she was giving me exactly the kind of ammunition I'd been waiting for. I slipped out the front door, circled around the side yard, and came in behind her. The crunch of gravel under my shoes made her spin around deer in headlights. For a long beat, neither of us said anything. Then I stepped closer, hands in my pockets. "Evening, Karen. Out for a little moonlight chemical warfare?" She tried to bluff it off. "I was testing your water. For safety." I raised an eyebrow. "In the dark? Without telling me? Wearing this?" I gestured to her ninja-like outfit. She flushed. The powder in her hand was already clumping from the humidity. I took out my phone and hit the screen. The red record light came on. Karen froze, then started stammering about how she had board authorization to ensure compliance. I didn't bother pointing out how absurd that sounded. Instead, I told her that she was trespassing, tampering with private property, and, my favorite part, on camera. Not just from my phone, but from the motion-activated security lights and the wide-angle camera mounted under the eave. Her eyes flicked up toward the little black dome, and I could see the panic bloom behind her forced calm. She tried to push past me toward the gate, but I stepped sideways, blocking her path. "You're not leaving until you put that container down," I said evenly. She dropped it onto the patio with a clatter and shoved her hands into her hoodie pocket like a sulky teenager. The next morning, I paid a visit to the police station. I didn't press charges. Not yet, but I filed an official incident report, complete with still frames from my camera and the short video clip from my phone. I also took the container to a local water testing lab. The powder turned out to be a high-concentration pool stain remover. Harmless to people, but strong enough to bleach out any coloring in the water and potentially damage the liner. In other words, she wasn't trying to poison anyone, she was trying to erase the very thing that made my pool famous. I knew the report alone would make her nervous, but I wasn't satisfied with nervous. I wanted decisive, public consequences. That's where the next HOA meeting came in. It was already on the calendar for Thursday night, and I made sure my incident report was added to the agenda. I didn't need to call her out by name. Everyone already knew, but I wanted it read aloud, on record, in front of every board member and every curious neighbor who decided to attend. When the night came, the meeting room was packed. Karen sat stiffly near the front, flanked by her usual allies, though they were noticeably less enthusiastic than normal. When my turn came, I walked up to the microphone, set down a neat stack of papers, and began reading. The report was straightforward. Date, time, description of the trespass, lab results on the powder. I didn't raise my voice or add dramatic flourishes. The facts were damning enough. Halfway through, I projected the still frames onto the screen. The first showed Karen in her hoodie, crouched by my pool. The second showed the powder mid-pour. A few gasps rippled through the audience. Karen's face turned the color of a ripe tomato. She tried to interject, claiming the images were misinterpreted, but the board president banged the gavel for order. When I finished, I stepped back, letting the silence hang. The president cleared his throat and said the matter would be referred to legal counsel. Karen mumbled something about protecting the neighborhood's image, but no one rushed to back her up. Even her allies were avoiding eye contact. After the meeting, people gathered in little clusters, whispering. I walked out into the humid night, feeling the tension loosen in my shoulders. I knew she'd try to spin this somehow, but the damage was done. The story would travel faster than she could control it. And that's when I decided to seal her fate with one final move. The following Saturday, I hosted another pool gathering. Not a party this time, something quieter, more curated. I called it Blue Hour. I invited a dozen neighbors, a few friends from outside the neighborhood, and even Greg the inspector. The LED lights bathed the pool in deep cobalt, casting shimmering reflections on the patio. I served drinks in cobalt glasses, set out blue napkins, and even made blueberry tarts. Every detail was a subtle nod to the color Karen had tried so hard to destroy. Halfway through the evening, as the sun dipped low, Greg leaned over to me and said, "You know, if this were an HOA-approved event, it could be a fundraiser. People would pay good money for something like this." The idea landed in my mind like a spark hitting dry kindling. By Monday, I'd pitched it to the board, not as a personal venture but as a neighborhood benefit. The HOA Blue Bash, with ticket sales going toward community improvements. My pool would be the centerpiece. The board voted yes, partly because it was a good idea, and partly because rejecting it after Karen's sabotage scandal would have looked terrible. When I told her, in front of 3 other board members, that the event was scheduled for the following month, her mouth opened and closed like a fish. She knew she couldn't oppose it without looking petty and hypocritical. For once, she was trapped. The event was a roaring success. Over 60 people attended, dressed in shades of blue, sipping drinks under string lights while music played. The photos went up on the neighborhood Facebook group, where they racked up likes and comments faster than anything I'd ever seen posted there. People started referring to the color of my pool as the neighborhood's signature shade. Karen, of course, stayed away. But she couldn't escape it. Her name kept coming up, always attached to the story of how it all started. The trespassing, the dye, the failed sabotage. It became one of those